There was one thing and one thing only that we spent our summer doing. That was building our fort. From the moment the last school bell rang in mid-June until the street light came on Labor Day, me and my buddies were invested in building our fort. There are a lot of questions you gotta ask yourself when it comes to proper fort building. This is serious stuff, people. Where are you gonna build your fort? What you gonna build your fort out of? How big is your fort gonna be? How much of your mother's stuff can you sneak out of the house and get into your fort without getting in trouble? But the most important question that one asks when building their fort is that when it's complete, who can you keep out of it? Because what good is it to have a fort if you can't keep somebody out of it, right? And for us 10 and 12-year-old boys in northern Wisconsin, we had two pretty clear groups that were not allowed in our fort. The first, girls. No girls allowed. A rule that in just a few years we would reconsider. Only to find out no girl wanted to come into our fort in the first place. The second group that we had to keep out of our fort was little brothers. No little brothers allowed. Are there any of you little brothers out here today? You are the worst. Just so you know, Matt, I know there's nothing ever been little about you, but you were a little brother. You're the worst. You ruin everything, little brothers, and you weren't going to ruin our fort. You looked weird. You smelt weird. You weren't allowed in it. Some were in and some were out. It's just the way it was. It was the natural order of things. But something interesting happened in the summer of 1981, something that had never happened before. Our little brothers organized. And they built their own fort. Who gave them permission to build their own fort? That's not the way we do things around here, and so we older boys conspired. And we snuck out. And we leveled their fort. Oh, I know, God. Every time I say that, everyone's like, you are the worst human being ever. Right? We leveled it, right? We knocked it to the ground, right? We wanted to make sure that they knew that they had to wait their turn like the rest of us had to wait our turn. We knocked it to the ground because what good is it to have a fort if you can't keep somebody out of it? Well, guess who heard about the little brothers' forts getting knocked down? The moms, right? Because one thing you can count on little brothers to do, tattle. And that's what they did. I see Brendan shaking his head at his brother, like, yes, that's what you do. And Noah's like, you're darn right I do. As soon as you start behaving, you'll know, right? You know, and so the mothers got together and they had the great summer peace summit of 1981, right? And the Hodag Peace Accords were announced. They emerged from the house with a message. Unless our little brothers were permitted into our fort, there would be no fort for anyone. There would be one fort or no fort. And so the great experiment began. For the remainder of the summer, there was one unified wooded fortress in the thicket of trees at the edge of our neighborhood, and for one brief moment, the big boys and the little brothers were one. And guess what? It wasn't too bad. It was actually kind of fun. Together, we could build a bigger fort. We had more kids to play capture the flag with, and we taught them how to play euchre and took all their money. We traded baseball cards back and forth. They still convinced my brother that Reggie Jackson was not a good player and he should just trade all of his cards to me. And he did. It was wonderful, right? It was a wonderful thing. For a moment that summer, we all learned something. That maybe the best part of having a fort wasn't who you kept out of it. Maybe the best part of having a fort is who you got to share it with. Well, if forts are the ultimate sign of belonging to 12-year-old boys living in northern Wisconsin, then for religious folks living in Jesus' day, it was the table. This simple piece of furniture was the most powerful symbol of belonging in the ancient world Jesus inhabited. Who you sat at the table with told people everything they needed to know about you. It told people who you thought God was and who you thought God's people were. I mean, how else can you tell who belongs to God unless you can point out those who don't, right? And the easiest way to point out those who don't is not to let them into your fort, not to let them sit at the table with you. You know, we have to be careful. We all have to be really, really careful when it comes to this God stuff, this religion stuff, this church stuff. Because it's really easy to believe at the end of the day that we are called to be pure and holy, and the best way to be pure and holy is to separate ourselves from those who aren't. And that's exactly what was happening in the story that Joe read for us this morning. There's a group known as the Pharisees, and that's what they were doing. Now, it's important that we remember who the Pharisees are. The Pharisees are church people. I mean, they're good church people. They're devoted to God. They love the scriptures. They pray regularly. They give generously. They serve on committees. I mean, these are the people who wake up early on a Sunday morning after they've been away on spring break to cook bread in the kitchen with middle schoolers. These are the people who come early to set up tables for fish dinner, and they're the same people who are there at the end doing the dishes. The Pharisees are the church people, and they're really good church people. Every church needs these kind of people. And so we preachers have got to be careful when we're talking about the Pharisees. We can't be too hard on them, because truth be told is, we are them. We're a lot like them. And so we pay attention, because the trap for Pharisees, for good religious people, is that sometimes we get confused into believing that our main task is to defend God's holiness rather than to share God's compassion. Sometimes good religious folks like us get confused, that thinking our main task is to defend God's holiness rather than to share God's compassion. Defending God's holiness, defending the faith, keeping it orthodox is exactly what the Pharisees believed they were doing when they refused to sit at the table with those who were different than them, who believed different or worshiped different or had different customs. We have to remember that they really believed in the sincerity of their heart that they were honoring God when they separated themselves from those who could not hide their imperfected lives. And that's why the scene in today's scripture is so interesting. Because these Pharisees can preserve the faith. They find Jesus, this one who claimed to be the Christ, the anointed one of God. They find Jesus sitting at the table at the tap house, or at Nello's, or down at the American Legion Hall. And here's Jesus sitting at the table with these tax collectors and these sinners, and Jesus looks like he's having a good time. And the disciples are enjoying a meal with them. Hopefully it was a steak with mashed potatoes and clam chowder. And so these Pharisees are confused. And you can't blame them, really, because this doesn't make sense. Here's Jesus hanging out with the little brothers of the faith. The ones you've been taught your whole life that you shouldn't share your fork with. And here's Jesus hanging out with them as if there was no problem in the world. And they're just confused. I don't think we should be too hard on the Pharisees. They're just confused. They come to Jesus and they ask in all sincerity, why? Help us understand. Why does your teacher do this? Why does he eat with these people? They don't honor God with their worship or with their lives. How can he sit so close to them? What kind of message is he sending the world? If he's not careful, people might think that just anybody can belong to God. Of course, Jesus overhears them. Here's the secret. Jesus always overhears them. And he turns to them and he says, out of deep sincerity and love for them, he says, go back and reread your scriptures. Go back and learn what it means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. Take note of what Jesus does here. Jesus turns to these devoted believers, these ones who just want to get it right. Quote at them in order to stick it to them, in order to embarrass them, in order to feel superior to them. He says, go back. You just missed something. Go back and reread it and grab it. And remember that our God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus reminds him that this movement that he's doing isn't about doing a new thing at all. It's not about breaking away or disregarding their tradition. No. He reminds them that this is a part of their tradition all along. And at that moment, Jesus removes the barrier. The barrier that sometimes stands in the center of church, that our acts of worship can never be separate from our acts of compassion. Our acts of worship can. And isn't that so important to remember right now? Because it feels like there is so much pressure in our culture and in our church in order to stand firm and separate ourselves from those who don't believe like us. Turn on the TV, follow the news. There's all kinds of pressure to say, I should not be willing to share the table with those who are different than me. There's this sense that there's nothing more important right now than to defend the position of your tribe. That's why it's good for us to hear the words of Jesus one more time this morning. Go and learn what this means. I want mercy, not sacrifice. Now, please, hear me loud and clear here before I get a note this week. This is not one of these feel-good, can't we all get along sermons. I am not asking you for the sake of civility to set aside your heartfelt and core beliefs in order to just get along. In fact, doing that, civility can become a very barrier. Because when I feel like I can't bring my full self to this open table, if I got to hold something back of who I am, that's a barrier at this table. And I believe Jesus says, come to this table in the fullness of yourself. Wouldn't you just have liked to have been at that table with Jesus and those tax collectors and sinners? And to have the Pharisees come in along at the table as well? I bet that was a great conversation. I bet there was great debate. I'm sure not everybody agreed on everything. But in that moment, they found humanity connected to each other. In fact, I believe right now we need robust debates. in full conversation. We got so many important issues facing us as a country and community and church that unless the table is truly open, not only to everyone, so we can bring those into that place and struggle and wrestle and be connected in that one kind of place. But Jesus removes this barrier as a reminder that anytime our beliefs get in the way of us acting with mercy or compassion when facing the real needs of real people, then that is a barrier that needs to be taken down. Because friends, here's what I know. After 20 years of active ministry, cancer does not care if you are a Republican or a Democrat. Here's what I know. After 20 years of active ministry, that addiction doesn't check in to see what your theological leaning is before it can take grip of your life. And here's what I know, is that hurricanes and tornadoes and house fires don't pick and choose where they do their damage based on how one voted in the last presidential election. And after 3 years of being your pastor here, never once, and I mean never once, has one of the persons who's gotten a meal here, Monday through Friday, you served 753 meals last month. Not one person in the 3 years that I've been here has come in and said, "Hey, Pastor, what's the theological leaning of the guy serving the macaroni and cheese today?" Here's the deal. At some point in your life, you're going to want to come to the table of compassion and mercy because you're going to need it. We're all going to need it. And on that day, you're going to pray that that table is open. And the only way to ensure that that table is open for you is to make sure that it's open for everyone right now. And that's what I love about Royal Oak First United Methodist Church more than anything in the world, is I believe you have gone and learned what Jesus calls us to go and learn. That God desires mercy more than God wants our piety. I believe that you already forts are the best when you can share them with others. And here's what I know. Is on any given Sunday, I can stand up in front of this church and I can say, I got a senior who needs their gutters cleaned. I could stand up in front of this church and say, Heather over at Common Ground said they've had so many kids through this last month that they've run out of pillows. I can stand up here and say, Amy Brown down at the Noah Project said they need more socks to put on the feet of the homeless. And here's what I know, is that in the next few weeks, Republicans and Democrats and independents and traditionalists and progressives and young people and old people and people of all kinds of different backgrounds will show up with their time and with their talent and their money because they believe that compassion and mercy matter. So I ask myself, how did you learn all of that? A month, you show up at a table and you take all the barriers away from it and you boldly proclaim that whoever wants to come to this table today to receive this blessing from God, they can come. And you come. And once a month you do something the world can't seem to do very well these days. You come to the table with people that you might disagree with on everything. But in that moment, you say, if you're in need, I got your back, and I trust that you have mine too.